I wanted to start off with the book, which I've checked
Great.
through on my recent vacation. And as I told you, right, I was a little bit skeptical in the beginning because I think fiction that involves financial markets is tricky, right? The stakes may not be high enough. There's a lot of things like it's hard. It's a kind of a technical topic, and I think, well, frankly, often people who want to write it, they come out of the industry and they may not have, it's hard to write very engaging thrillers. So I love Master Minion, and I think there are a lot of layers and a lot of really
Thank you.
interesting ideas in it. And I could really tell that you were both deep in the industry, but also deep in the countries that that the protagonists in the story kind of touch. So I'd love it if you could give me a little bit of background. I mean, you worked at Bridgewater, you've spent time in Russia and China before. Give me a little bit of your journey to the book, and how did the story come to you? And just let's start off with a little bit of about Paul and how you found your way to that book.
Sure. Um, Great, and also thank you for having me here. This is a lot of fun. This is at the after you spent years in isolation creating one of these things. It's great to connect with readers. Let me just make a big picture point about what I think is special about a fiction story that's different than nonfiction, and then I can then get into the history and the background. And I think the strange thing about fiction is there's just a weird paradox, which is on the one hand, you're just making stuff up. And on the other hand, it's sometimes easier to say something true by making something up. And I think the big shift is that in the real world, you never quite know what other people are thinking. You have a hypothesis. And fiction, I think, more than any other art form, allows you to create a bunch of characters and imagine their interior world, which is so much of where the mystery and the richness of life is. And so while there's tons of great nonfiction books about Russia and China and finance and personal development and psychology and all these types of things that the book touches on, you can't do that. And my first book was a nonfiction book, and I know that well. And then they'll segue into the world I was in, where I was in for years, both in journalism and in investment management, most of the time with Bridgewater Associates. If you make anything up, you're done. You're
Mm.
fired. And so for me, it was unbelievably exciting to be able to sit down there and just make stuff up. So stepping back, I grew up in Washington, D.C. My dad was a scientist there, and DC's got a lot of different embassies, and I was always very curious. I'd love to hear actually more about your background, but I was always very curious about where these people are from. And it was a really different world then. The Soviet Union covered a huge chunk of the world, and what we were told in school is that they wanted to kill us and bomb us, and they were literally, we talk about nuclear Armageddon and all that. So it was very curious for me to be able to understand what that perspective is. Why did those people want to kill us? What was that about? So I went to college at Brown, studied a year of Russian. I was terrible at it. And I had a vague notion that I wanted to be a writer. And I felt like a writer needed to have some sort of unusual experiences.
Mm.
And so when I graduated college, my main requirement was for a job is I wanted something that would be interesting, that would give me some sort of profound life experience. And I had a couple different options. But the year I graduated, and it's somewhat the degree that happenstance matters, the Soviet Union collapsed. And for the first time, you could go there more easily than you ever could before. So some graduates would go to San Francisco or they would go to New York. You all of a sudden could go to Russia. And that's what I did. I got offered an opportunity to go there, and I started as there as a teacher, and then I began selling news stories, and that's when I really began to work as a professional writer. Then there was graduate school. I transitioned to being a less of an observer, more of a participant in financial markets. Worked as a banker for 6 years. Then I was at Bridgewater Associates for 16 years, and began with a very narrow understanding of financial markets. The very first thing that I traded was a single futures contract in the Canadian dollar. And then from there began trading currencies and bonds and stocks and all that, and really learned about portfolio management and all the lessons that were along that. So I had trading as a writer. and I had training in finance, and I wrote a nonfiction book, and I saw there was a completely different way of relating to the world than investing is. In other words, stories from the author's perspective, you spend a lot of time alone trying to distill something. As one writer acquaintance of mine said, trying to write the bullshit out of an idea.
Mhm.
And for me, it involves lots and lots of rewriting
Mhm.
to cleanse it. But then you put the story out there and you get these, what I describe as pigs from the universe. The story connects with somebody and you get this response back. And it's kind of a magical process that you've created something, hopefully something that's quality. I think only time will really tell. And so I was very enticed by that. So that was sort of the writing and investment. I'd had an idea when I was a banker in Boston that first came to me of sort of like this Armageddon of financial markets. It was during the first tech bubble, and there was, these huge flows up. And I just had this feeling like there were these Hollywood films, like these asteroids about to strike. And I was like, it's the same thing when you get these huge financial flows. So that was one idea that was percolating. And then I was at a dinner and Paul Volcker was sitting next to me. And I asked him about what he thought about what was going on in Russia. And he said to me, I stopped going there when they murdered my friend. And that was interesting to me. And that was really the spark of the book, which
Mhm.
was there is a lot of stuff that happened in this book is based on actual historical episodes. Now, none of these things happened at the same time, but there was this horrific murder of a deputy central banker in Russia. And that was sort of the spark. And then it went from there. I know it's a long answer. I'm about to be quiet. What I really wanted to do was relate to people how these places felt from the inside. And
Mhm.
in particular, I don't think you can understand them if you don't understand the secret police. So a little bit the way a movie like The Lives of Others brought that world to life.
Yeah.
Those were the type of influences. So there's a lot there. But anyways, that was what was all going
There's a
on.
ton there. Thanks for sharing, and I mean, I grew up in Germany, but didn't really experience, I was born in '86, so I didn't really experience the East-West division consciously. Um, but what you just touched on, I mean, there's a lot, but this sort of understanding of how these places, and I guess in particular, Russia and China, how they function on the inside and how, um I think one thing that the book does very well is sort of you have a US based hedge fund, right? And then you have this connective tissue in terms of the protagonist who goes into those worlds and kind of tries to gather intelligence and relate, as you describe, kind of what's going on the inside. And you can kind of understand how far removed that is from the experience in the US where there's, okay, you have rule of
Yeah.
law and, and you don't really have an understanding here of, um, of the kind of the different forces shaping, like, you think of things
The
as,
weight.
and there were a lot of great quotes. I'm gonna,
Can I say one thing before you
yes,
jump into the
yes.
quotes? So I lived in Russia for 3 years before, that period of time. It was so foreign to me that even the first year I was there, so this is total immersion, I still didn't get it because it's just a different wavelength that's very difficult for a person who grew up with rule of law, with those concepts, to believe that this isn't some sort of joke, that it's actually real. And the final thing I came to, which helped me understand, is it is medieval in all that sense. It is medieval. So if you think about your picture in your mind about the way Europe was working in the 14th and 15th century, there is a king. You pay tithes.
Mm,
There is palace intrigue. People are poisoned. You could end up in prison for no reason. Rule of law grew out of all of that, but that world is still alive and well in parts of the world. And it's a very bizarre thing that a place with a space station that can do complicated computer programs both has the medieval in it, but it's there. And what you're looking at in Ukraine right now is exactly that. It's
yes.
a land grab for disobeying the emperor or the czar, or whatever you call it. And the punishment is death.
Yeah. Alright, so let me introduce two quotes
Right.
and
Nice.
they'll connect exactly what you talked about because you also wrote an op-ed about,
Yeah, yeah.
your family relationship. So, But the first one is the idea that the state itself was criminal was something Americans had trouble getting their mind around. And the
Yes.
protagonist kind of says like, okay, he's trying to grasp at it, but then interestingly, he says the boss, and we'll have to talk about the character of the boss, which is just one of my favorite. It's just so I related to it so much. The boss meaning the portfolio manager of the hedge fund, and the character's like, well, the boss might understand. In the boss's mind, there were predator and prey, right? And so you're either predator or prey, and the boss decided to be prey. So intuitively, somebody who's made it to the top in the U.S., at least in an economic sense, may actually grasp that dynamic a little bit more. So I'm curious how if that reflects some kind of experience in reality, and then I'd love to talk about your experience with Russian propaganda and Ukraine because you the Wall Street Journal op-ed that you wrote about that was really interesting.
So I think there's a strain within investment management of people who have that worldview of predator and prey. And I remember one person early on when I was learning trading described holding a position. I think he was long the market, and there were a bunch of shorts, and uh, and he was basically trying to calculate how much money the shorts had relative to his long, and he was like, "Listen, it's either I'm gonna live or either it's like life or death
Mm,
type of thing." And he used a term which is not politically correct, but you obviously hear a lot of that in the financial market. He goes, "I'm custard, and there's Indians up there, and there's Indian up there in the rocks." That's the way he looked at the world. And there's a lot of people, not all of them by any means, who think that way. And so there is a strain of that. And then there's an added twist that the boss is African American. And so he has a more complicated, he could understand a little bit more about how the state could be that evil an
mm.
influence. So there's that added layer there as well. So, the characters, their inventions, uh, and they're composites of tons and tons of people I saw sort of whittled into types. And then there's also, there's references to other, literature there. So what Robert Penn Warren's description of the governor of Louisiana, those types of, so I tried to get all that in there as well. And like you, I found that a lot of money books were awful. And I wanted to create a money book that wasn't. That was the goal.
Yeah, I think you've definitely succeeded in that, and I think mostly because there's these composites, these characters, they have that rich inner life, and then they find themselves. This I really enjoyed. On riffing on the theme and the title, right? They find themselves in these systems, and it's
Yes.
always this master minion relationship, and that can be a relationship with money. It can be a relationship with kind of the forces in your own organization, the hierarchy. There's a lot of
Yes.
going into how people navigate these systems, whether it's, a corrupt state, you're in Russia and you sort of have to arrange yourself with the circumstances. And maybe you think of yourself of not being corrupt, but then it's still sort of part of your family. There's a lot of this to navigate. And so I'm curious, like, tell me about how you came to that theme. And then also just maybe on Russia, you made this comment that propaganda outweighs actual experience. So I found a little bit of this theme of people close their eyes to reality in the book too. Like they don't want to see what actually happens, or they kind of wrestle with that and how do I put this without giving spoilers? Um, right?
Well, it gives people a whole bunch of terrible choices. There's a quote at the
Yes.
beginning of the book from Chekhov. I should grab the copy off my desk, but basically that life is a vexatious trap. And I thought that was actually unbelievably powerful. And so you see these traps recreated in many different forms. I just think they're more virulent in those other cultures. And so Wall Street has that. And I think that money on Wall Street has an addictive character,
Mm.
and people are willing to put up with a lot to endure that. And you have these jobs that pay a huge amount of money, but many of them don't involve that much talent. I would say being a person like the boss is a different type of thing, a sort of Soros like character who can see the future. That's slightly different. but many of them don't. And so some of the characters I was trying to get out of the hedge fund are people that are getting these insanely big salaries, like there's a chief trader there, and they have this constant insecurity, and they're stuck in this system where they love the money, but they don't have the talent to do something outside of that. And so that's that master minion relationship. And then in the secret police types of places, there's places like in Russia or China, they're so corrupt. And I saw this firsthand with families. It's unbelievable that there is no escape. And so the classic, one of the characters there, he actually wants to be a reformer and
Mm.
non-corrupt. And there are people who you will meet in these places there, but corruption has sort of infected his family. He's basically on the payroll of his father-in-law, who is tied to all these nefarious things. And that repeats again and again and again and again. Like, you can't extract yourself from it. And that's one of the reasons why they're so hard to change. And guaranteed, if I were to write a novel about what's going on right now, guaranteed that's going on right now. There's top people in both those countries, Russia and China, who realize what's going on is terrible, but they're
Mm.
trapped.
Yeah.
And I wanted to give people who are outside of the system a sense of what it's like to be trapped. Like, viscerally, what does that feel like? It's very scary. And yes, there's a lot of denial that goes on around that to try to close our eyes. And I've tried to talk about that in my own family to a degree. My wife is Russian, is what you're referring to. And I've had a series of conversations with her mother, and they're just incomprehensible from a Western standpoint.
Yeah, it's tricky, right? Because I think what the book gave me is that appreciation of when that communication breaks down and you feel like you speak different languages, right? And you realize somebody else is just watching, for example, the propaganda channel,
Yeah.
and you can't even find that common ground. But it's easy to miss also the fact that their life it takes place in this very different system, right? And so they're subject, like you said, to to different traps and different dangers too. And so it's maybe for me it was the idea was also like to try to not be as judgmental, right? Because I'm
Yes.
and you also refer to being behind the firewall, right? The person enters China and suddenly you're cut off from information flow, and people have to sort
Yes.
of navigate the different levels of how do I get access to not the truth, but to facts, right? Like when somebody else decides that for me. Um,
The
so
non-judgmental thing you're saying, that's
yeah.
music to my ears, because what I wanted to like, on the one hand, I do think that you need to distinguish between good and evil, not be a
Mhm.
moral relativist. At least this is my own perspective. And on the other hand, you have to work very hard to understand the world through another person's eyes. And what I found is a lot of the reporting and writing that goes on here, it sort of looks at things in either a good or evil type of, and I understand where that comes from. And again, there's a role for it. But I think it's deeper to try to first understand why these people are thinking the way they're thinking. And so for me, like, creating the character of the characters of the Russian and the Chinese secret police was a really powerful exercise. And this is a very strange thing about writing fiction, which is that after a while, multiple rewrites, the characters really begin to seem like real people. I know that seems like you're adult or something like that, but they do. Like, you can sort of imagine, like, if you were having a dinner party and these people around there, what that would be like. And that's maybe when they come enough alive. And so the character of the Russian secret police, there is this trend in people. He really believes, and you see this a lot of these places, that there's order and there's disorder.
Mm.
And they really believe that disorder works against the vast majority of people's of interest. And you're like, well, if I have to pay for that of literally shooting innocent people or controlling people's thoughts, doesn't that seem like a high cost? They do not look at it that way. And these people are very prevalent in there. And also the degree of chaos that both Russia and China have
Yeah.
experienced. China experienced hunger in my lifetime. Acute hunger. I was born in 68. In my lifetime, acute hunger. And the most recent Substack post, I put out a picture that I took in rural China that actually showed like a ration board of in a city where they're
Yeah. So that.
so so I think what the very conservative elements will say in these places is, listen, okay, your system works for you, but it's very specific circumstances. If we apply it here, we'll get chaos, and we've experienced chaos. And so to try to illustrate that way of thinking and that clash it's very real here, but it's much more powerful there because in other words, there's a clash between the liberal and the conservative here. Just there, the secret police have the upper hand.
Yeah, it's interesting, and you touch on that theme in the book, right? So the in particular in China, the history, the sort of the culture that goes back thousands of years versus here, and this idea that over that frame you have cycles, you have disorder, right? You have chaos, and at the same and that today there's a moment where the boss talks about change and how hard it is for people to imagine the world just being very different from what
Yeah,
they're experiencing now. But then
yeah,
if you look at history, right, there were moments when, China was the dominant power, and like there's all these different configurations, and people can't actually imagine that. And he's like, well, but you have to, and especially if you want to be a successful investor, because when that change happens, it's when fortunes rise and fall, so to speak, or people, I guess, die
right.
depending on the country.
That's right. I do think that really good, really great portfolio managers have something. I think that there's a certain type of test I've seen, personality test, that looks at how many levels somebody looks at life at. Do they, are they somebody who looks at life of like 7 levels or 5 layers? And the vast majority of people can't, they have trouble thinking very far ahead. And I think really exceptional portfolio managers can look at something that's today and imagine a radically different set of circumstances. And their mind works a little bit like a kaleidoscope. In other words, they're staring at the world and they shift the kaleidoscope and they keep shifting the kaleidoscope and it's literally changing every single day. And they're imagining what that future is. But some of those things are radically different than what we're living through right now. And those are the people that correctly call stock market bubble tops and crises and things. And it's a weird thing. There is an element to it that I think is quite artistic. Because if you think about artists that create stuff that seems really out there initially, but then 10, 20, 30, 40 years later, people are like, this is the most beautiful thing I've ever done. They're
Yeah.
doing the exact same thing. They're imagining a set of pictures in our head that are going to resonate. And it takes a while for, look at like a Jasper Johns or something. And this is a theme of painting in the person. So I spent a lot of time looking at different painters. But if you look at this or the classic Picasso's and Cézanne's, all this, when it came out, a lot of it wasn't, or a Basquiat, it wasn't looked at the time, except by a relatively narrow group of people, as having some sort of timeless value. And then with time, people came to the art because they were seeing something ahead of time. So I think really great artists have this view and really great portfolio managers do, but they're using their skills in slightly different ways.
Yeah, that's
It's
interesting.
imagining
Yeah.
pictures of the future.
That's very interesting. I think there's a Bruce Kovner quote where he basically talks about his strength being able to just imagine these different configurations and actually think them through, which I think is what you just described. And I totally agree with um, the idea that at a certain level, really great investors, they kind of transcend this, oh, just take data and analyze it and run the numbers and be at this sort of mechanical craftsmanship level, and you go to some degree of artistry where it also gets very um it's hard at that point um to understand what the lessons are, because it becomes a very kind of individual experience, and like somebody
Yes.
operates at this level, it's like, well, I can't actually replicate that, so I enjoy studying it, but I'm not sure
Right.
what the it's a very unique and rare thing. And
Well, a lot of investors will be, sorry for interrupting, will
no,
be
no, go ahead.
very focused on data, which is obviously important. And they'll look back like what we're going on right now with the pandemic. And they'll say, listen, if you look back, at 7 of the last 8 cases, when the Fed raised rates this many points, this is what's going to happen next. And that may be what's happening. But that's literally looking back on history and saying, okay, this is predictive of the future. And I think you certainly want to be familiar with history deeply to be a good investor or to be a good writer. You have to know the genre. But the powerful thing is that it doesn't neatly repeat. And so what's different about this thing? Well, it's pretty different than the 1918 pandemic. And then this one, you have this asynchronicity where China was shut down and then it's opening up. And then you have fiscal transfers and fiat money, and at the same time, these very powerful vaccines. So you get these big seesawing of forces that
Yeah.
are in some way similar to what happened in the past, but not really. And so I think the truly great investors are able to be informed by all that history, but then diverge from it in appropriate amounts, which is kind of a magical thing, which is why they fetch the prices they do.
Yeah. Um, I don't think this is not from the book, but from your Substack, where you talked about, and I love the metaphor where you call it kind of markets and the money river, sort of this
Yeah.
constant flow. And you said there are two tribes, the catastrophists and the equilibriumists.
Yes.
Um, and it was funny because then I was thinking about the character of the boss who has this very, this idea of financial Armageddon and the
He's
dollar
a
will fall.
catastrophist.
Right. And he has this big construct of how everything's going to change, which on the one hand, sometimes you need that big thesis, but then it can also be deceiving because if you attach
Yes.
a lot to it, and reality turns out differently, you can blow up. And I was curious how you think about um, maybe yourself, but also kind of the people you've observed, and is it possible to be in one camp and then just do that mental switch when it's like, oh, this is not working out, so I guess or because it's very easy to observe the people who are always in one camp, right? They're gold bugs, or
Yes.
like they always have that one thesis. But have you seen people kind of pivot back and forth between this? Is the boss, able to let go of that? And where would you place yourself?
Oh, it's good. It's a good question. So I feel like most people aren't able to pivot back and forth, and I think it's exhausting to do it. And it's easier to be rooted in a specific way of doing things. I buy bonds when the yield curve is steep, but I sell them when the yield curve is inverted, and blah blah blah, and that type of thing. I think being able to switch back and forth is rare, but I have met people that do that, and some of them are not famous, traders. They've done very well, but they're kind of reclusive, quiet type people who I've met over the years. So I think it's possible, but it's extremely rare. It's not great from a business perspective because it's difficult to replicate. In other words, if you're trying to amass assets under management as a
Mm,
firm, people like that are really tricky because what if, God knows what's going on inside their head and when they're switching. And if you can't explain it, then all of a sudden you can't really scale the business. So it can be very, very powerful, but it's not necessarily something that is going to be institutionalized. I would say, by the way, that that same thing of getting locked into a certain way of thinking, you also see in both China and Russia relative to the West. So the Marxist thinking that Xi Jinping in particular is clearly a big advocate of, that is deeply rooted with a pretty mechanistic framework, which is that the West is going to collapse because of its internal contradictions. That the rich people will exploit the workers. That's what they're incentivized to do. The workers will become outraged. There'll be a rebellion. The whole thing will collapse. Like based on his statements, it sounds like he truly believes that. Whereas if you look at the Western system, I think one of the things about it is that it has a flexibility built into it. If you look at Germany's history, obviously that flexibility can sometimes snap in terrifying ways. So that's a reality as well. But if you look at the US, either the more recent history or you go back to civil rights or the Great Depression or the Civil War, there were all these periods of time when it really did look like Marx's thesis was going to be right, and then he was wrong because the system transformed. So I think that it's not only the West and portfolio managers that can get stuck in that, but also political leaders. I think what's informing Putin right now to some degree is a really bad reading of history and what he thinks that these timeless and universal types of things that he can apply. In terms of myself, I would say I'm my style of since leaving Bridgewater, investing my own money, I would describe it as more of a hybrid. So I believe in writing things down and studying history and things like that, but I don't rigidly follow rules in what I do. And maybe if I was trying to build a money management business, I would, but I'm not. And so that's sort of where I've arrived at, which is a little bit like the book. I try to listen to the arguments of the equilibrium type of people and listen to the arguments of the catastrophists. And there's a little bit of truth on both sides. So that I try to sort of find my way through that.
Mm.
patch. And the pandemic was a classic example of that. For a while, it felt like the catastrophists were winning. And then here it was, the thing came out, everybody been worried about a pandemic, but lo and behold, the system actually responded in all these unbelievably unpredictable, beautiful ways that, they actually figured out the right monetary fiscal thing, at least to alleviate the worst of it. They probably created too much money, but they were trying to do the right thing. And the venture incentivizing these people to come up with these vaccines, it worked. Oh my goodness, amazing. And then we got back to an equilibrium, and here we are all unmasked in gyms, and there you go.
That's a good point. And you just wrote this morning about Xi and I guess China more broadly. And I wonder that there are these sort of like Taiwan, there are these kinds of things that are basically it's unknowable what will happen, but it will have huge implications if something does happen.
Yes.
And and I wonder how you treat these um scenarios, right? Because you have I wonder, so maybe the first question is, do you feel because of your interaction and knowledge of those places, you have a better read of what could happen? Or is it so complex and all behind the scenes that it's basically unknowable and we're all kind of poking around in the fog because it's just
Well,
uh,
it depends whether I have my investor hat on or my writer hat on. So the easier answer is the investor standpoint. So from an investor standpoint, I don't trade things I can't understand. So going into the Russia so it's where are we? 23 is 22. So going into 21, I held assets in Russia as an investor. I held Russian bonds and I held Russian stocks and paired them together and was getting a nice return for it. And then I saw what was going on in Ukraine, and I said, "This seems crazy." But what do you do if all of a sudden the risk of your position is expanded more than what you'd anticipated? You take less risk. And then I called up all my contacts in Russia, and everybody said he's bluffing. There's no way he's going to do this. And then I took less risk. And then as we got closer to it, I said, "Listen, I cannot predict this." And then I just closed all my positions in 21. And and then the minute he invaded, I closed all my positions in China.
mm,
And my thought being, listen, if Putin is crazy enough to do this in Ukraine, who's to say that she can't do this thing in Taiwan? I certainly can't. So from an investment standpoint, listen, there's other ways of making money. If I can't understand something, I just remove it from my portfolio. And that's one of the reasons I love liquid markets. I'll do it in a nanosecond. Um, in terms of um, in terms of being a writer on this thing, that's more nuanced in terms of that. And I think that that's part of what makes an interesting story is another person, when you're writing well, I think it's sort of like for each character, for each situation, there's sort of like a balance between lightness and darkness that we all have within ourselves. And a good story and a good character, it seems to me, is sort of traversing that balance. And you're not making those sort of more digital decisions that you make as a portfolio manager. Like, I can't understand this. I want to get rid of it in my portfolio. As a writer, that's interesting, those situations. And so you want to explore those. And I think that that concept, one of the things I was trying to also elucidate to people is there's a lot of smart people out there who know financial markets are important, but don't understand at all how they work and how they direct them. And I wanted to make, in a visceral sense, this concept of financial war come alive. We are in a financial war right now. It's crystal clear what's going on with the chip stuff to China and what's going on with what they're trying to do to Russia and what Russia's trying to do to Europe. This is financial war. There's people getting killed, which is the most tragic, but then there's all sorts of different squeezes getting put on. And I wanted to make the mechanics and the actors of that thing seem as real to people as a battlefield scene. Now, I think a battlefield scene will always be more interesting as a writer, just because I don't know. I've looked at so many of those types of things. It's I can't not look. That
right.
new Netflix thing, The All Quiet on the Western Front. I remember reading that book as a teenager and it having
Mm,
a huge influence on me, just how vivid it all was. So I think that will always trump. But I think in terms of explaining the world, trying to make this that these are people taking decisions with a set of assumptions. The assumptions can be faulty, and that's part of what without revealing the plot, that's part of what was going on in this book, and that they're at cross purposes to one another. I thought that the reason why money is so boring for most people is it's an abstract topic. It's like writing
Yeah,
about water or environmental warning, but money is people. And if you make it about people, then all of a sudden the stories come alive.
that is. I'm gonna have to stop right there because that I think is not just very true, but it's also hearing you speak it and like speak it out loud. I'm like, oh, this is a theme in my own writing, my own exploration. I mean, I spend time in banking and at family offices, investing, and for a long time I was like, why is this so hard? Meaning for me, it's like I'm not a numbers person. Like it's just I'm trying to make this work, and it's just like feels far away from me. But like I've always been interested in the people navigating that system and how they think, mm, and there is that connection, and that connection is very interesting to me. And when it comes to purely, building out a spreadsheet and analyzing a deal, I'm like, okay, this is just not. Um, uh, this doesn't this doesn't interest me in the way that it has to be really good at it. But I wanted to touch on what you just said. So people misunderstand or don't properly understand markets, and and there's kind of two elements. One is, and I think you hinted at that, to understand markets or to understand some of the institutions that shape markets, you have to understand kind of the people. And you wrote about your uncle who was at the Fed, and you
Yeah.
talked about, and you're like, okay, if I look at the Fed, really people and kind of institutional incentives and their reputation, that kind of stuff. Maybe first let's touch on that. What's your when you look at markets and kind of do you think about it as kind of a set of actors and you're trying to understand those people, or what's the trade-off between the data and understanding individuals and who are also, I guess, limited in their influence, right, by the forces of the market?
Both is so you're asking good questions too. So just to you raised something in your response to what I just said about stories. I just want to touch on briefly. Then I'll talk about the data people thing. People think in stories. That's how we think. Numbers are really important for measuring stuff, but the way people literally think is stories. And stories are about feelings and emotions. And the feelings and emotions are relatively limited in number. And all story people have been telling stories for thousands of years, and they revolve really only around a couple of themes. Escape, which is this book is about, is one of them, and a couple of primal emotions. So to make a story resonate with people, you need to be in that zone for it to work. And so when I'm writing either a nonfiction piece or a fiction piece, one of the things I really try to do, which has taken me years to get to, is just listen, like, what am I feeling right now? Where is that coming from? And then when I was writing Master Minion, I was definitely I was imagining like how, what is going to irritate each one of these people? What's going to scare each one of them? What do they really want? And you have to be, to make the scenes come alive, each one of those things, you have to be very locked in, just the way you would, and by the way, in a business meeting. If
Mm,
you're somebody who's good in a corporation, you have a very rich understanding of everybody around the table, what they want. And when you're writing a book, you're doing the same thing. It's just all the characters are in your head. In terms of actual, investing, you do need to do both, I think,
mm,
which is, you need to, really be rooted in the numbers, but you really need to think a lot of time about the actors. And I'll tell you a story that I've shared once before, but I think it's a powerful one. I had the occasion a few times in my life to speak with Soros.
mhm,
And, I spoke with him in, I believe it was January of 2000, like 2 weeks after Putin had been Putin came to power December 31st, 1999,
mm,
if my memory's right. So I asked him, I said, "What do you make of Russia's new president?" And he just looked at me and he said, "Not to be trusted." That was all he said. And that's an example of somebody way out ahead of, I mean, think what came next, like George Bush. Like, I looked into this man of his eyes, he has a soul, you're dealing with a psychopath, and he got totally played. And so I think really good investors do look at both. If you wanna trade a currency, you're looking at the current account and what real interest rates are and what's discounted, da 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 da, all that stuff. But you really need to think about the people that are in charge. And I have used that throughout my career. So early in my career, when I was working in a bank, and I remember trying to offer, strategic advice in the 1998 Asian economic crisis. I had to guess what Greenspan would do.
mm.
And this is probably, you were probably a young kid at this one, but at the time it seemed really important. And the question was, is he going to cut once or twice or three times? And when I looked at that, I thought, well, this guy grew up during the Great Depression. He's probably scared that it's going to cause a depression. So if it were him, he'd probably take an extra cut just to be sure that he doesn't get one. Now, can you prove that? You can't. You
Mm.
can't. It was probabilistic. And then the piece that you're referring to, when I think about the Fed, I was imagining, okay, say I am the chief of the Fed, and I've just committed one of the worst mistakes in monetary policy in like 50 years. How am I thinking? I'm probably thinking I'm an idiot and I need to repair it. I mean, that's a very reasonable. He might not be thinking that way. He might be somebody who's just straight raw numbers. He's just going to follow the data. But probably a part of him is feeling stupid because people are people. And I know when I do something stupid, it lingers with you.
Mm.
So yes, I try to use that what I'm thinking.
This is so interesting. I Yeah, I read about the Soros story, I think in one of your Substack pieces. And what's interesting to me, well, there's a couple of elements. Is one of the themes in the book is right the person, the protagonist, he's kind of running around the world, and
Nick,
yeah, he's trading information, right? And he's
yes,
trying to assemble the mosaic.
yes,
And I think a lot of times we, thanks to the internet and whatever, people sit at their desk and you open up Bloomberg and you open up Tigris and whatever, and you have all of your information digitally. And the process in the book is very different because basically there's a paper trail, and there's certain information that's important, but access to that comes to interacting with people and then sort of trading and building relationships and building trust, or maybe getting played, right? And I think Soros, for example, is somebody who also in his career had access
yes.
to central bankers or to certain people, and strikes me was very good at that. So I'm curious how you think about that human element of relationships and finding intelligence, being on the ground. Like, where did that come from? How was that part of your career, maybe, or how? Just tell me everything you know about that,
It
because
was,
I
it was,
think it's
de-
fascinating.
it's definitely part of my career. And it started when I was at Bank Boston, that the CEO was invited to the G7 IMF meetings and didn't want to go. And the invitation got like sent to a bunch of people. They all refused. And then finally, after like four refusals, it landed on my desk. And I was like, are you kidding me? Yes, I want to go. And I just tried to meet with, like, I like talking with people. And so I would try to meet with everybody. It was a little bit like the podcast. I just tried to seek out people who'd be interesting. And if they said no, no big problem. Talk to the next person.
Mm,
Now, to do that, you need to be able to read between the lines, sort of imagining what they're like and how they fit together. Now, in authoritarian countries where everything is monitored, it's required. So, for instance, for this book, I asked a Russian businessman I know. I did a lot of research on it. I never served in the military. The main character did, so I interviewed a lot of military people, and then I went down to interviewing military translators, like literally walked me through everything because I wanted to get that right.
yeah.
I showed it to people in the CIA and basically said, "Listen, you're espionage people. I'm not." One retired person, one current, and I said, um, "I want this to, if you're an espionage person, I don't want this to read hollow. How would you?" And it was fascinating what the holes they picked in my drafts. They're like, "Oh, that was fine, but that's totally ridiculous." There's a chase scene in Gorky Park, and one of them said to
Mm,
me, "Oh," he goes, "Oh, that's perfect." And I said, "Why?" And he goes, "Because it's so stupid. Nobody would ever do that, and you basically have him as a kind of inexperienced guy. It's perfect for that's exactly the type of mistake an inexperienced guy." I
mhm,
thought I was being clever, and I was like, "Okay," so I left that in there. But then I tried to, through contacts, get people, yeah, on the dark side in Russia and China to look at this. It During COVID, impossible. So what happens is in Russia, for instance, there's a lot of ex-KGB people who then get hired by private businesses to actually interact with the KGB or the FSB now, so that if they're trying to extort money for them or something like that, they have his professional contacts, and he's like, "Oh, yeah, we served in Dagestan together, let's try to." So I said, "Could I talk to them about the book?"
Mm.
And what everybody said is nothing electronic. If you were in Moscow, which I couldn't be because of the various, they said we could probably set you up with a meeting and you could
Mm.
ask them questions. And so what I did is I asked the non-KGB Russian business people, I said, and various different plot elements, I said, is this plausible? Is this plausible? Is this plausible? And there's some pretty crazy stuff in there. And they were like, "Oh, that's totally plausible." They're like, "In fact, I'm sure it happens." And I was like, "Really?" I was like making things up that seemed pretty extraordinary. And I ran it by them. They go, "Yeah, of course the FSB does that." And I was like, "Okay, we're safe." So in those places, so personal contacts were definitely a part of my training and trying to understand that. So I had a sort of rough idea of what that would look like. And then in those countries, in China, everything happens at the dinner table. The official meeting is very boring, but then, you go out to dinner afterwards and various different things. And that's when you actually learn stuff. And there's a whole group of people, Europeans and Americans, who are fluent in Chinese, who basically their career is doing that.
Yeah, it's interesting because some of those scenes, um, there's a lot of there's the importance of etiquette, right? And like what can
Yes.
be said in what order and what question can be asked or how does it have to be phrased and things quickly like some things are not to be talked about or some things
Yes.
are too hot or like a foreigner can't talk about like there's all of these nuances and um so I'm curious how you think about what that means for somebody who is on the outside and trying to make investments trying to understand what's going on but really doesn't understand those subtle rules of that social game. Is it possible for somebody to come in and like build trust and do that or is it just something where you'll
I don't think
always
so. I think that those places are too internal. And if I look at, I look at people, very smart investors, what's happened to them over the quarter century I've been dealing with Russia, most everybody's gotten crushed. And they've gotten crushed for those reasons. And by the way, a lot of my Russian entrepreneur friends have also gotten crushed. And through there's so much material I could have put in the book that I did, but through crazy types of things that you would think, well, this is an insider. I had one friend there who built a factory, and he spent a lot of money to build a factory. And after the factory was built, the people from the locale where it was said, now need to pay us $1 million. And he said, I own the factory. And they go, aha, but you don't own the land beneath your factory. And he was like, okay, but this thing is not gonna produce $1 million of profits, and he had to shut and he just lost. Boom, poof, gone. And that type of thing has happened to a lot of people. So I think that once you're in a place that is that opaque and corrupt, it's
Mm.
very, very difficult to create wealth. That's just the reality because, the people in charge are not incentivized whatsoever to do that, and it's very different in this country. And so if you look at the chart of the 10-year return, or I have to look at the exact date. So the Chinese stock market is 0. There's a
Mm.
reason for that. And it has to do with share issuance and erratic government policy and all those types of things. And it's not only foreigners that suffer from that, the locals do as well. And so these medieval systems are about retaining power. They're not about creating wealth.
Yeah, that makes sense. So especially wealth for outsiders, right? There's that dynamic of maybe if wealth gets created, it just gets captured by somebody who can extract or extort it.
But
Um,
but think about Jack Ma right now. Like, how much wealth does he actually have? It's an interesting question.
it is,
Like, how
right?
much of it can be taken away from him, and what's he doing hanging out in Japan? If he goes back to China, what would that look like and all that? Like, how stable is that? It's not stable. And so those systems are so loose that they can create huge wealth increases, but it's unbelievably unstable, which is why many of those people try to get the heck out of there as fast as
Yeah.
they can and keep the money somewhere where it's can be held on.
That was one of the fun paradoxes that gets touched on in the book, right? Is on the one hand, there's this sort of thesis floating around that, the West and the US specifically is on the decline, the dollar is going to
Yeah.
collapse, right? It's all these like over leveraged, like it's all the talking points. And then there's this moment where he's like, well, if that's true, why is everybody here in the supposedly rising nation trying to get their wealth out and like into offshore
Yes.
real estate and offshore accounts? Like, why is everybody supposed like fleeing the winning system? And it's because even if that is true, you're still not kind of safe. It's still kind of fragile. And for the individual, I mean, and there's like all of these contradictions. I just love that about the book. Um, I wanted to ask you something else about the I guess the hedge fund environment that Nick finds himself in. And
Yeah.
here's a great quote. He's like, "Everybody understood the boss had money. They, the hangers on, me included, wanted that money, and we all tried to destroy each other to get it." Right?
Yes.
And so I think that the takes, even though they're not the main theme of the book, on kind of hedge fund politics or office culture or just that I think were very on point. And I wonder if you think that's sort of give me your take on that. Is that, you know, generally the case? Is this like a very unique culture? You're like, this is like a bad example of a hedge fund, and or does it just attract that kind of person? Like, just tell me about what you've
I
learned
think,
about that.
I would say it's more my take on corporate life.
Oh, corporate.
So I think that corporate life can give you something remarkable. It ties you into a structure. It gets you something, much bigger. I remember when I was working for Dow Jones, initially, this is very early on in my career, I would write an article, and then the headlines would go out around Times Square. They used to have that ticker there.
Yeah.
And I remember one time getting out of the subway there like 20 minutes after I'd finished work and seeing my thing going around there. So if you're tied to one of these big corporations, you're part of something much bigger than yourself, and it's exciting. And the thing about these corporations, whether it's a hedge fund or whether it's a major tech company or a major media company, is they have scale.
Mm,
That's the reason that's exciting about them, is that they have the ability to create a product that, can achieve this unbelievable thing which we've had in the last 50 years, which is a scale that was just incomprehensible to previous time. However, with that creates unbelievable wealth. And with that unbelievable, I think that wealth is corrupting in terms of how people behave. And so when you get close to that, it brings out the worst in people. And it's particularly, at least in my experience, if it's really in American corporate culture, it's so complicated because on the surface, people are unbelievably genial and nice and warm
yeah.
because you're rewarded for being that way, for being quote unquote a team player. But underneath the surface, you have this fight for the limited pot of gold and the promotions and all that type of thing. And I think it probably works the same way in many corporations. I haven't worked in tech or entertainer or hospitality, but for people I've spoken with in those sectors, it seems to be pretty much the same way. And so I just wanted to describe that because I don't think I hadn't seen portrayals of it that it was well described, which is that you get something and you give something. And like I looked at a lot of films about Wall Street, and all of them are about how corrupt the system is and the people are out doing no social good. And I look at them, I was always so frustrated because it's like it's more complicated than that.
Mhm. Yeah.
They are doing something that has meaning, and there's this other element to it, and you really have to talk about both of them to get it right. And particularly literary people, it's basically like Wall Street people are a little bit like the way Germans used to be in our films or now Russians are. It's like
Yeah.
they are the convenient evil person.
Yeah.
And I'm like, "Okay, well, look at a system without Wall Street people. Like, that's what North Korea looks like. So that's also not good." So you gotta look at the whole picture.
Yeah, I think it's very easy to paint this caricature, right? Where the
Yes.
entire financial system is just like, oh, it's corrupt, it's bloated, it's extractive, and then you paint all the people in it as just these one-dimensional, very greedy,
Yes.
um, again, caricatures. And I think there's obviously an element of truth. It does select for people who are looking to make a lot of money, but there is this whole element of, I guess, well, the solving of the puzzle, right? And applying yourself to trying to figure out how to allocate capital and how to navigate that market. I mean, that's what fascinates me. But it comes with, once you're in an organization, with what I think you really painted a great picture of this. There is a zero sum game happening
Yeah.
in the market as a whole, and then in the organization, where you're in the team and you're fighting for your bonus, and
Yes.
you're sort of stuck in that. And there's a moment, or there's a theme in the book where Nick basically realizes, like, okay, I have to somehow get out of this, or I will become like the boss. I will become an
Yes.
addict myself. And
Yes.
it strikes me that you obviously, I mean, you spent a career in financial markets, but now you've chosen to go a different path. So I'm curious, is there an element of you in that thinking, or do you think everybody ultimately transforms into, if you're that substance for too long, you transform into somebody who can no longer
There's
leave.
there's a lot of things. There's a little bit of me in every single character, truth be told, even the diabolical ones. As they say, write what you know, and you have to imagine, what each one of those people and it draws on strains of yourself. Um, I think that money can make you crazy. Like it's a very strange thing. We need money. Being poor, I've been in very limited circumstances. It's unpleasant. But it's also true that too much money, I think, is not good for you. It's a little bit like food.
Mm.
And, when you were asking those questions, I was imagining like how different is it in other industries. Like imagine you're sitting around the table with Tim Cook and he's making 80 million bucks or 100 million bucks or whatever type of thing. And you're the guy that's making $1 million. Now, $1 million puts you in the top 0.1% of salaries there, and you're sitting next to him, and you're like, "But this guy's not that much smarter than me, and he's earning $80 million." Like,
Yeah.
I guarantee you there's somebody in that room thinking that way, because people are people. And so so I wanted to get at a little bit the thing, like, in these big money the hedge fund thing is what I was familiar with, so I could write about that more. But I'm trying to make a more universal point that money can make us crazy. And you have these people, many of the people in the fictional hedge fund were motivated, and I tried to get a little bit, all for their various different reasons of why the security of money was a major motivator for them. And I found that the people who grew up in very difficult circumstances and they wanted a ton of money, part of it was maybe because they were a little bit greedy, but part of it is because that's what felt safe. They
Yeah.
grew up in such a limited circumstances, that desire for safety just, was almost unextinguishable. Um, the but I think that it does have this quality that's a little bit limited in your thinking. And I think that there are like, what is somebody who is making really great art doing? It's not something that can be measured almost in their lifetime. Like there's a lot of artists who at the time they seem brilliant. And then with the passage of time, they're like, not so much. And there's other artists at the time, nothing. And then like the classic example is Herman Melville. When he was writing Moby Dick,
Mm.
nobody thought it was a good book. And then well after he died, people were like, no, this is an American classic. That can happen to you if you're in the artistic sphere. So it's highly uncertain.
Yeah.
But the concept, and I've run into a lot of people like this, they have both this desire for security, but they have some sort of higher aspiration they're aiming for. It could be spiritual. It could be in terms of service. It could be artistic. And I think a lot of times it's buried in people. And Nick is a little bit of an exaggeration of that
Mm.
because he really wants to, and I have a sequel in mind, everything like that, where he wants to go. But I think there's an element of that in many, many people. And it's terrifying to open up that side of you. I know one person who left the hedge fund industry and became a movie producer. And he describes it a little bit, he's straight, but he describes it a little bit almost like coming out,
Mm.
like to say, like, I'm an artist. And there
Yeah.
was an element of that I was trying to say in the book. So I think that this idea of coming out and saying, I want something beyond money and power makes people feel very vulnerable. And I wanted to get that into a character because I know so many people where some element of that is bubbling.
Yeah, I found that fascinating, and it really resonated with me, probably because I was struggling with that same notion, and for years, um, enjoyed writing, but didn't do anything with it, and had this
Mm,
very, um, active voice that said, you can't make any money with that. That's not a career.
classic,
Silly. It's like, who are you?
classic.
And like, I grew up in Germany. So like just the writing I do in English, it's already like a step up, like writing in a different language. So there were all these reasons why, no, try, just do the thing that makes sense, and compensate. And then later, once you're rich, you can do whatever, right? Then it doesn't matter.
Yes.
But it was sort of
Yes.
this complete fantasy, that was to me, uh, just took a lot
To open up, right?
to
It feels a
open
little bit
up
like
and
coming up,
discard
right?
that.
Saying like,
Yeah,
no, no, no,
yeah,
this
yeah,
is me. And
yeah.
so you're another example of it. And I think that that's widespread. And I've seen people, I remember, as I mentioned, I grew up in DC. I remember a woman on my street who was just an absolute tough ass political system. She worked for this congressman, like long hours, Diet Coke and smoking and what's the big vote and stuff like that. And at a certain point, she just snapped. And I remember that she worked crazy hours for like 15 years. And then literally for a year, she just sat on her front porch, just smoking and, drinking and Coke or something and staring off into the distance. And I was like, wow, there's something in there that broke and came out. And I find that I've seen that with so many times. And so I wanted to try to make that again vivid with a person. And also I was very interested, like, I can't I can paint stick figures, but the
Same,
idea of
same.
somebody the idea like, I think artists are really cool, and so
Yeah.
the idea of that and then I talked to a lot of artist friends, I said, "What would he be looking at?" "What would he be reading?"
Mhm.
Like, it was a way to live through there. Like, if I could paint big canvases like he wants to do, I would have done that as opposed to writing, but I can't. And
Yeah.
so I was like, "Okay, well, I'll imagine that character, and that'll allow this person to come to life."
Yeah, I love that in the sense that you can get a sense of the way this character the way Nick goes through life. He's like he goes into a situation and he starts thinking about like the colors and and like he's like, oh, I would paint it this way. I love that because even if you're not a painter, you can kind of see how everybody has their own intuitive lens on the world or their own individual lens. And like for me, it's very different. Like I can't really visualize things that well. So it's not that at all. But then you start to think of like, okay, what do I default into, right? Like
Right,
how do I
right.
think about, how do I capture the world? So, I wanted to touch on one last metaphor of yours. And I think what I enjoy about your writings is you manage to like make these, just make these beautiful metaphors. And one was the flows and eddies of life. And there were a couple of examples, but just how do you, that was sort of a broader, like, how do I think about life and the different paths it can take it? Tell me about that, just that metaphor,
Yeah, it was
if
a
you don't mind.
Substack essay, thank you.
Yes.
My basic thought was, um, uh and some of it was sound a little bit banal. It's the difference between speaking ex prompto versus writing, but basically, life is happening to us every single day, and there's a real limit for how it goes on. One of the reasons I left Bridgewater when I was 52, and one of the reasons was I was like, I literally you're talking about the analytical and the emotional. I calculated how many months I was gonna live. I
Okay.
just literally looked at it like an actuarial table, and I think when I left Bridgewater, I have to redo the calculations, but I had 384 months to live. And if
Statistically speaking, expected.
statistically
Yeah.
speaking, and I thought about that, and there's a pretty wide range around that if it's an individual.
Yeah.
And so I thought about that, like, listen, these 384 months are gonna come, like, there's nothing I can do. That is just the flow.
Mhm.
And how do I stay in that for myself? And I think that each one of us, and it was at least it was very hard for me to see when I was young. You have to listen to carefully, like, what is that real thing that works for you?
Mm.
Like, there's a period of time where I had no money and I had a young family, and money really, really made a difference to try to make a comfortable tent, if you will, to sort of shelter them. But a little bit like you, when I was thinking inside, it was like, this isn't the primary thing that motivates me. Like, if I've got $1 million now, if I next year have $1 million and $100,000, and the year after that I have $1 million and 200,000, I was like, that does not actually motivate me. And then those months are going by. It's going 383 and 382 and 381, da 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 da. And there are these eddies that you could get stuck at in
Yeah.
life. And there's lots of eddies. The eddies are unbelievably, and there's the obvious eddies. So, I think addiction is an eddy, and a lot of people wrestle with that. And there's different forms of addiction. I think anger can be an eddy, and I think that being in a job you hate can be in an eddy. So there are all these different eddies that can develop in different ways. And the tricky thing about a real eddy is it's very hard to tell when you're in one. So if I
Mhm.
listen to you and you describe this thing that you have this, I think I want to write, but I think that that's really stupid. That's an eddy.
Yes.
And maybe initially you feel like I'm having this thought, oh, that's a stupid thought. But you're going around and around and around. That's an
Yes.
eddy. Now, how the heck do you get out of that eddy? And everybody has these things. And there's so many, they come in our relationships. The other day to my wife, she asked me a question and I answered with a little bit the wrong tone. And then I was going for a walk and I was like, you schmuck. It's like, you were being a little bit, so I texted her, I said, "Hey, sorry, I was a little bit." That's an eddy. So we all have this thing, there's a flow to a conversation, there's a flow to our lives, there's a periodicity to our lives, when you're young, you have this type of thing. And I was like, for me, the goal is just to try to be in that flow as best I can and do a better job of recognizing those eddies. And, like, in this transition that I've made, when I left Bridgewater, I didn't have a paycheck anymore. I was terrified, absolutely terrified, even though I'd had a spreadsheet and calculations and maybe know what to buy the writing and stuff like that, but I was terrified. And then after a while, I realized that's an eddy too.
Mm.
Like, you have to get, like, the feeling of not knowing if this interview was gonna be good or bad or what exactly I'm gonna do afterwards. It's like, I have to get comfortable with that discomfort.
Yes.
That is the flow to bring this thing out, and the eddy is that feeling of fear that I'm getting. And it affects everything, if I look at my trading, I've had pretty good results, but I've taken way too little risk historically. Why? Because it's been a little bit like, I don't know if I could,
Yes.
but you don't want to take too much risk because that's a different form of eddy because you're overconfident. And so that middle ground. So what I was just trying to describe is I feel like we're all on this journey together and we're all doing it individually. And it's just recognizing that flow of time and trying to be as in sync with it as we can, which is exceedingly difficult because that kaleidoscope notion of what's true, I think that's true for all of us. It's shifting a little bit moment by moment. So knowing where you go on the river is very, very subtle.
Oh, that was beautiful, and the
Thank you.
calculating the months reminds me of this Tim Urban piece where he visualizes, he calls it the tail end. He visualizes how much time you probably have left with certain people in your life, and how
Mm,
basically by the time you read this, you probably run out of a lot of the special moment with parents or siblings. And it's very easy to forget that, and right, and be in the eddy, and sort of, I guess what struck me with is, I always thought about it as kind of loops of behavior or thinking, and you're in there and you're not actually aware that you're
yes,
circling. It's sort of, well, this is how it is, and this is my reality, and like this is the thing that's happening to me. And it's hard to break that frame and step out of it. Like, no, there's no
totally.
reason. Like you can totally make that change, but only if you develop that awareness. So I love that piece. And I really look forward to. Sorry, go ahead.
I was gonna say that's why it's an eddy.
Yes.
In other words, if it was obvious, it wouldn't be an eddy.
Yeah.
Like, we're smart people and we're struggling. And I'd also say that we as humans, we're at this very unique point of history because we've created so much wealth. We have an opportunity to choose that pretty much until 100 years ago, thousands of years, people were they didn't have the opportunity to choose. Now we have all these choices. It's complicated.
Yeah.
And so I think we gotta, have high standards for ourselves and give ourselves a break at the same time, because the nature of an entity is an optical illusion.
Yeah, it's hard you mistake it for reality, and then you like
Yes.
you mistake the illusion for reality, and you sort of don't understand that it's in your power to change it. But also, I mean, I think a lot about this is why maybe the so I live in New York, and I'm sort of acutely aware of how the my social environment, how that does shape me, right, in,
Mm,
in different ways. And so, like, if you work at a bank, right, then a lot of your peers are also, in
yeah,
a bank, and they have certain ideas and certain values, and whether you like it or not, that sort of starts to shape how you look at life, or you run around with a lot of cognitive dissonance all day, right? And I think your description of that hedge fund, and the politics and the social interactions, it just seeing that in a story to me is very powerful because it reminds you of um how it happens in your own life in whatever community you're in, and how you, if it's not a positive community, how that can become an eddy, right? And you're like, well, this thing is important, and it's just because it's mimetic desire, right? Like, this is important because it's important to all the people around you. But you sort
yeah,
of, after a while, you stop noticing that that's the
yeah.
dynamic, and you stop noticing your own core. So again, I can't wait to share some quotes from the book and from your Substack
Awesome.
with people. I really look forward to it. I think I look forward to whatever you're writing next. I think there's a lot of layers, a lot of great ideas, and I'm really glad. Graham Duncan is the one who told me about your work. Really grateful to him for that recommendation.
Graham Duncan. I don't know
Yes.
who that is.
He's an investor. I'll share some of his writing with you after. It's
Cool.
very much worth reading. So thank you,
Well,
Paul.
I'm
This was
genuinely thankful for you reaching out to me because, I'm starting, I'm relatively early on this path and, uh, looking for opportunities to spread the word. And so this is a real gift which you've given me. I'm really genuinely appreciative. And, maybe we have a cup of coffee sometime.
I would love that, and the pleasure is all mine. And this was terrific. Thank you for taking the time.